Good evening,
Hey,
ladies and
everybody.
gentlemen.
Welcome to the Out of Control Show with Nick and Joe. Good
And
evening
Nick, I'm going
indeed.
to ask you, you got to be more in the middle.
Yeah, I'm just trying to, we're making a few technical adjustments. How's that?
A few technical adjustments. Well, that's
That's right.
better.
Yeah, I thought
That's
so.
not too bad. That's not too bad. Um, yeah. So, okay. How's my sound? Am I too hot? Am I distorting it all? Clipping?
No, nope. Sounds just fine.
Good, good. I'm glad because I'm actually using my lavalier mic tonight as opposed to my boom mic, my regular microphone. Because why?
Right.
Because I have a couple of people coming in here tomorrow to do some taping and some interviews, and so we're just using my equipment. But if you're on the news somewhere, you don't want to be, um, uh, you don't want to have your boom mic sitting in front of your face, right? Now, of course,
That's true.
our listeners and our viewers, well, our listeners obviously don't know about boom mics versus lavalier because they can't see us anyway, but our viewers certainly can. And I don't think they care that much about what kind of a microphone, as long as the sound quality is good. But when you're on
As
a
long as
news
they can hear us and
program,
understand
that's
us.
a different thing.
Yeah, that's true. All right. Well, it's been an interesting week here out on the West Coast. We went camping. There's a place called Malahat Pass up here, and they have the Malahat Skywalk. So we decided we're going to take the weekend off and just jump in the truck and go camping at a place called Tunnel Hill Campground, which is a few minutes from Malahat Skywalk. Well, it rained all day Saturday, so that kind of put the kibosh on that. But what it did do is allow us to go visit places like Cowichan and Salt Spring Island, Fulford, which is a small town on Salt Spring, and oh my good Lord Joseph, these places in Cowichan. Okay, I'm going to give this guy a little plug. Cowichan Bay is the name of the place, and it was the Utter Guys. What was the name of it? The Utter Guys what? Ice Cream and More. Utter Guys Ice Cream and More. If you're ever in Cowichan Bay, you got to go in there. They serve the best ice cream to begin with, okay, because that's their specialty. But he also has all the retro candy. Like, do you remember those little boxes of Popeye cigarettes? They were candy. The kids would get them and pretend to smoke and eat them. He's got them. He's got pink elephant popcorn in a box. I haven't seen that stuff in years. And I'm walking around, I feel like I'm 5 years old all over again. You remember those boxes, right? They're about 6, 8 inches wide and about that high and about 2 inches thick. And it was pink candied popcorn inside. You remember those?
Of course I do. And the Popeye cigarettes, the candy cigarettes, I remember well as also. The thing about those
Yeah.
is I didn't even think they were legal anymore. Certainly they're not made anymore. So one wonders where exactly he's getting his supply from and how old it is.
Well, they don't actually call them cigarettes. And there's a
No, of
couple other
course
little
not.
modifications they've made. But he brings a lot of his stuff up from the States. He wants to put up a wall of gumball machines. And I said, well, just how many gumball, how many different varieties of gumball are there? He said, well, I can only get 9 because the government in Canada won't let me import the rest because there's dyes and things in it they don't want the kids ingesting. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, how many kids are going to eat gumballs by the handful, right? You're talking about it's a treat once in a while to get a gumball. Anyway, so
you
he had
obviously
those. It was just,
you've obviously
go
forgotten
ahead.
your childhood days. You yourself may not have worried too much about how
I
many
stumbled.
gumballs you ate, and
I know what you're going to say.
I of course I don't think I ever had a gumball, but
Oh
I
my
will
God.
tell you, I had friends that would try to set world records with respect to how many gumballs they could get in there and chew. And it's amazing that
I
nobody
will admit
actually
I've had
died.
enough of them. Yeah, well, hey, that's evidence that it can't be that bad. But I do remember chewing them to the point where my jaws would ache. it was like, oh man, I might have 3 or 4. And in those days, it was a nickel when I was growing up, a nickel for a gumball. I'm sure a nickel, a dime, whatever it was. It wasn't a loony. And 25 cents was the price for a long time. But anyway, the whole point is he's got this 1970s, early 80s feel to the place. He's got that era rock and roll playing. He had Queen playing some old Queen tunes playing over the speakers. You go in there, and it's just like everywhere you turn, it's a blast from the past. And they're a young couple. They've only been married 22 years. And I was talking to him about, how successful. He says, well, it's feast or famine in here. It's insane busy or dead quiet. And I said, well, that's retail. But I know when we go back to Cowichan Bay, I'll be stopping in. So I want to give him a big plug. The other guy's Ice Cream and More Company. And it's right there on the harbor side, right in downtown Cowichan Bay. If you miss it, you're trying. But man, treat yourself. For those of you out in the West Coast or anybody coming to the West Coast, go to Salt. That wasn't on Salt Spring Island. That was over on the big island, Vancouver Island. And oh man, what a treat! So we had a great weekend. We just came back from Victoria in time to do the show and wandered around. Victoria is a stunningly beautiful city and all kinds of places to eat. They had a yacht there, like it was a private yacht. That thing was almost as big as the steamers we used to sail on. It had to be over 250 feet. It was huge, absolutely huge. So anyway, be that as it may, it's got nothing to do with the price of tea in China.
No, but
What I did want to start with,
one wonders whether or not you actually were able to see Justin Trudeau on the yacht, because surely it has to be one of his friends.
well, if he was, I have no use. No, you know what? The way that yacht was set up, unless that you wanted to be seen, you could stay inside the yacht. It had stateroom windows, deck to deck high, but they were tinted. You can't see in, which makes sense. But you could stay inside that thing, never leave, and I am sure they cater to your every women there. It's just insane, and the harbor was just busy. It was a beautiful day. BC is a beautiful place. There's no doubt about it. And they're going into a local by-election here in Langford, which is the regional, the MLA stepped down, the guy who was here before. So there's a local by-election. So I'll be keeping an eye on that and see who wins. Anyway, what I did want to get into, now that the fun and frivolity is over, there's been reports. I made a mistake this week on Facebook. I know that's hard to believe, but I actually made a mistake. I posted a story that was out of Alberta. It was from the Lakeland News, and the RCMP had laid 32 arson charges during the fire season. The problem was the story was 2 years old.
Well,
okay,
and before you get into that, let me just stop you there and make a quick comment on that, Nick, because I also have cited some of those news reports from Alberta and arson with respect to wildfires, and you're quite right. There's nothing really that's up to date, except that there were a number of brush fires in Calgary, in the Calgary and southern Manitoba area, where they actually did catch the person because he confessed. But it takes time. It takes time to determine whether or not arson was committed, and then to investigate as to whether who was the culprit. So there's no surprises there, and you're going to find that a number of the fires that were set this year, that wildfires this year, were arson. I have a couple of other things to say about that, but I'll wait till a little bit later on.
Okay, well, the one thing that is relatively new is Danielle Smith, the Premier of Alberta, is bringing in outside investigators specifically to investigate arson fires. They had 174 fires in Alberta that they didn't know what the source was, which is outrageous. Because let's face it, forest fires happen for basically two reasons. One, you have lightning strikes when it's really dry, or it's human error, or somebody lets a campfire, throws a butt out the window. It's caused by
Right.
humans, and that's the bulk of your forest fire. So when you have 174 that you don't know what the source is, the red flag's got to go to the top of the pole. And I think she's doing it right. So, because somebody sent me a clip of what looks like. Now, I'm not willing to say that this is what it is, because with internet magic, you can do pretty much make anything look
Right.
like anything. But it looks like a helicopter dropping napalm behind it from a firefighting bucket and starting fires. But there's no context to the picture. We don't know anything about that. So for anybody who's seen that clip, wait, let the investigation play itself out. Don't make the mistake I made and jump the gun too fast. Because for all you know, that's part of a controlled burn to stop a major forest fire, where they actually will burn a section to keep the fire, use up the fuel before the main fire
Right.
gets there. They do that a lot. So maybe that's what you're looking at. Maybe it's a water bomber dropping water and somebody got fast and loose with graphics and covered up the water and put flame in its place. I'm only saying that it's tempting. It's really tempting to jump on that bandwagon, because there is some truth to it. Some of these fires are definitely set by human beings. There's a story out of where a bunch of people in Quebec, they had a problem with it. Half the province of Quebec was on fire, and that's where all the smoke is coming from, that's flowing down into the United States. But I have a story here from Epoch Times, and I've been saying this for years. I think that part of the reason why the fires are so intense, I've been saying it's poor bush management, wilderness management, bush management, forest management is the word I'm looking for. Anyway, so let me share with you a paragraph or two about this, because I think this underlines what it is I've been saying all along, that unless you groom an area, you're going to have more intense forest fires. Okay, so while there have been suggestions that wildfires are becoming more frequent and severe due to climate change, environmental and economic professors interviewed by Epoch Times said the number of fires has been decreasing for decades, and that the cause of the fires in many cases can be attributed to poor forest management. The Prime Minister said that climate change is causing more and more forest fires, and the records show the opposite, said Rick McKittrick, an environmental economics professor at the University of Guelph. The Canadian Wildfire Information System shows that the number of forest fires has actually been going down in Canada since the 1990s, as several wildfires in northern Quebec led to thick smoke plumes that blanketed cities across Ontario and the eastern U.S. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau claimed that Canada is experiencing more and more of these fires because of climate change. These fires are affecting everyday work routines, lives and livelihoods, and our air quality. We'll keep working here at home and with partners around the world to tackle climate change, address its impacts, he said on Twitter on June 7th. So he's saying that climate change is the cause, but the scientists, it's funny, they say follow the science when it's in their favor, but the moment you have a situation where the science goes against the norm, what's the word? The script, when it doesn't follow the what they've been saying all along, when it throws water on their assertions, then all of a sudden they don't want to pay attention to the science, because it's not about science, it's about politics and it's about money, and that's what it's been all along. And now this study here and this information just verifies what you and I've been saying for years, that this is poor forest management that's making these fires that much more intense and harder to put out. It's not global warming.
Well, I've resisted, because I've talked about this on my show as well, Nick. And I've generally resisted trying to attribute anything to any cause. The fact is, you have to come into this with a certain amount of perspective, a broader perspective, and
Right.
there are a few things. Just in response to um, some of the data and information that you've passed on. The first is that actually this year in May, Canadian Geographic magazine, which is a prestigious and very credible magazine, and certainly not right wing by any
Right.
stretch of the imagination,
Mhm.
published an article on forest fires. And the theme of the article was what we're doing more in order to track down to determine whether or not forest fires were actually caused by arson and to catch the arsonists. And there's a lot of information in that particular article. It's not a long article, but the first thing that catches your eye is that um, while it may be true that at least for the first part of this year, we have seen more fires than is normal. The fact is that we are
Right.
nowhere near setting a record for forest fires for 2023. And the reason is because Canada has, on average, about 8,000 forest fires a year, according to Canadian Geographic.
Yeah. Well,
8,000.
look at the size of the
And
country.
so this is the point I'm making, is that the fact that we got out of the gate this year a little faster and with a little bit more intensity than normal is just part of the normal up and down of this kind of thing. So it's not an indication of anything. That's the first thing. 8,000. And by the way, of those 8,000 forest fires, more than half of them are actually caused by human beings. Now, when I say that, I'm not necessarily saying arson. Arson is a problem.
No,
Okay, arson is a
yes.
problem, but it could just be campfires, just carelessness. So the majority of
Yep.
8,000 forest fires a year, approximately on average, are caused by human activity that has nothing whatsoever to do with global warming. And of those, a certain percentage are always caused by arson. And that's actually the theme of the article is how can we do a better job of determining which ones were caused by arson and which weren't? And how can we catch the perpetrators? And more importantly, how can we tie the science down more precisely so that we're able to actually secure convictions because there's no point in arresting somebody and sending them to trial if we can't secure a conviction. So that's what the focus of the article
Mm.
is. And it sort of brings a lot of different things into perspective. Look, the other thing is this you're quite right about the controlled burns, etc., and the forest management. But the fact is that Canada is, again, we've said this over and over again in different contexts. But in this context, Canada is so large and we have so much forest in this country. The fact is that even with a concerted effort to manage our forests the way that you're describing, we'd never be able to do it. Most of our forests grow wild,
Not on a
okay, and that's just the fact. So some years you're going to have more, some years you're going to have less, but there is no connection, demonstrable connection, measurable connection between climate change, whether it's naturally occurring or man-made, and forest fires. Every year you have wet spells and you have dry spells. And the frequency and the
right.
longevity of each of those periods changes every year. It's nothing to do with climate change. It's just the normal variance in the weather. And when you have a drier than normal season, you're going to have more fires. And the fires are probably going to burn longer and more intensely. But that's just natural. But the problem here is that everybody is so fixated on this nonsense about man made climate change and we have to stop climate change, man made or otherwise, that they lose sight of the fact that, I mean, everything can be blamed on climate change. everything can be blamed on climate change. One of the things we're talking about a lot today is the trans rights and gay pride and all that stuff has become much more controversial this
Right.
year, I think, so far than in previous years. I'm surprised nobody's blamed it on climate change, because everything gets blamed on climate change these days.
Don't give them any
And
ideas.
I'm surprised, Nick.
Don't give them
I
any
am
ideas.
shocked that we have not blamed the war between Ukraine and Russia on climate change.
They will get around. That's coming up on the menu too, by the way. There's something I want to, not so much about the war, but it's our response to it.
Sure.
Oh man,
So
driving me nuts. We'll save that for a little bit later.
it's this. All of this is, and to hear our prime minister and then the president of the United States with no evidence whatsoever, to claim that our forest fires in Canada are the cause of are caused by climate change. It's absurd. It's embarrassing. And I just don't. These days, I just don't know how to handle it. What these guys are doing. I've always been. I've always had a healthy skepticism about big government programs, etc. Okay, but these guys are taking it to grotesque, absurd levels. I mean, if
Right.
anybody after the COVID fiasco and now this and everything that's going on, how can you trust? How can you take these guys, any one of them, seriously anymore on anything?
Well, if you're looking for a fight from me, you're
I
not going
didn't
to
think
get
I
it.
would, Nick.
The only thing that I've heard, not on that one, the only thing I've heard that makes even the remotest amount of sense was rather than leave forest fires under a provincial jurisdiction, they want to start a fire brigade for the country so that you have a highly trained group of people with support aircraft and all that. Just like the U.S. Marines, man. When there's a fire, you send these
I
guys
would,
in. Now, if they need some,
yeah, I would support.
I'm
I
just
would
going to say,
support that.
yeah, me too.
But
Absolutely. Because, okay, that's what you're doing is you're using your assets and you go to the worst places first because every forest fire is really bad if it's in your backyard, but you have to prioritize because there is so much acreage. You're right about the size of the country. I know firsthand. Here in BC, there's millions of acres of bush that's never been touched or, is very remote or hard to get to, and the mountains make everything difficult. So you have this group, and however big it is, who knows? But that's for smarter people than I am to figure that out. But I think that's about the only thing to come out of this, other than Daniel Smith bringing in outside investigators to look into what's going on in Alberta. That's about the only thing that's been said that makes any real sense. The rest of it is utter knowledge, utter nonsense. And the part that drives me crazy, Joseph, is when you point this out, you're the dummy. You're the guy who doesn't know what he's talking about. I've always said I can tell the difference between a thunderstorm and somebody peeing on my boots telling me it's raining. There's a difference. Okay, just because your feet get wet doesn't mean it's the same thing. And I'm tired of having to try to get people to understand. Take CO2 gas as an example. It's the most important gas on the planet, and you want to reduce it? Are you insane? And it's like nobody went to biology in grade school and high school. So here we go again. So it'll be very interesting to see how this plays out this year.
Yeah, the only thing that I would add to this discussion, Nick, is I was a little surprised to hear that Daniel Smith had been reaching out for quote unquote outside help with respect to arson investigation, because the truth is that they have been doing over the years a pretty good job at investigating the source of these of brush and forest fires in Alberta. They have had prosecutions, they've made
Right.
arrests, etc. So I would not have been one of those who felt that there was a lack of bureaucratic attention paid by the authorities to the attempt to determine the cause of these fires, and when it is determined that it was caused by deliberately set, then investigating more fully and being able to arrest the perpetrators and prosecute them successfully. And I think that Alberta has done a pretty good job of that in the past. But again, that surprised me. I didn't feel and still don't feel that that's an area of deficiency in the province of Alberta. But one more note on this, Nick, and then we have to take a quick break, and that is that I just think it's so important for people to understand that even with hundreds of forest fires burning wildly in Canada, and even if we set a record this year, the characterizing of Canada as burning, which I've read in a number of publications, some here in Canada, mostly south of the border, and certainly I've heard this. I think that the Prime Minister mentioned this recently, used that term in question period in the House of Commons in last week. That is just categorically false. Canada is not burning. The people who say that are people that have never wandered 10 kilometers outside of their urban area where they live. They have no concept other than the theoretical, I read it somewhere in a book or I saw it somewhere on TV, an assertion that Canada was a big country. We all know Canada's a big country, but until you get into a car and you drive from one end to the other, okay, and that's going to take you at hard driving, pretty close to a week. Until you do that, and that's just east to west. That doesn't even cover north to south.
That's such a small sliver of the whole
east
country.
To west is longer than north to south, but north to south is pretty significant as well. And it's funny because nobody really ever talks about north-south traveling. It's always east-west. But anyway, the point I'm making here is people don't appreciate how big a country this is and how much forestation we have in this country already. We are not burning down. Canada is not burning.
No, of course not.
All right. It's, again, maybe we're having more than usual at this point in time, but talk to me in December when the whole fire season is ended, everything is out, people are getting ready for the holidays, okay? And then we can sit down and we can have a nice, over maybe some spiked eggnog, and we'll have a nice little discussion about whether or not, in retrospect, it was a record-setting year. But even if it is, this is not evidence of climate change. There you go.
No, it's not. The only thing I'll say just before we go to the break about Danielle Smith, I don't know what's in her mind. I'm not trying to speak for her, but I'm thinking with the number of fires, they may be overtaxed with their investigators, and she's bringing in help to make the
could be
help with that. It's the only thing I think of.
It could very well be. It could be. Yeah. All right. Well, let's go for a quick break then, Nick. We'll be back in a couple of minutes here on Out of Control with Nick and Joe.
All right, welcome back to Out of Control with Nick and Joe. I'm Nick, he's Joe, he's in Ottawa, and I'm on the West Coast. And there's a great geographical gap between us, but philosophically, we're not all that far apart. Okay, now before we get into the next topic, Joseph, I got to get something off my chest. I saw this on in the news this week. I posted about it on Facebook or on Twitter, I think. And the fact that Trudeau went to Ukraine and promised another $500 million to Ukraine to help in its war against Russia. Look, I don't mind helping people defend themselves, but I think you ought to be able to defend yourself first. The total, if my memory serves me correct, he gave $250 million the first time, all kinds of hardware, ammunition, and supplies. He sent troops over to help train them. He's got 4 of our Leopard tanks over there, leaving us with about 4 here that actually work. I'm being a little facetious, but not by much. And he's giving Zelensky a big hug. Now, we've said this before, Joseph, in this particular forum, that Zelensky, he's not Churchill. He is, in essence, his own dictator. When you shut down a country's press and say the only people who can run for office are people that I endorse, and the only people who can say anything about me from the media have to say nice things, those are dictatorial attitudes. Ukraine was never the hotbed of modern Western democracy, and we have to stop pretending that it is. So he takes over there a bucket full of about $1 billion of our money and hardware and gives it to Ukraine, while our guys have to buy their own helmets. They have to buy their own flak jackets because the ones they have don't fit. They have to eat out because the government didn't provide any logistics, so they don't have to go to local restaurants and buy their own food. Well, guess what? Now their credit cards are maxed out, and they're asking their families to fill in the gap, either with parcels from home or put money on the credit cards so our guys can keep eating. What kind of nonsense is this? I was furious when I read this. I am so embarrassed for our men at arms and what they have to put up with under this bozo. It's just enough to make me sick. Think about it, Joseph. Can you imagine? They'd say, look, we want you to go and fight for Canada. Here you go. You get a rifle and a bullet. Everything else you got to buy. Who's going to want to do that? And how is this, if this war gets out of hand over there, because no one knows where this is going to go, just because it's been kind of restricted to Ukraine, Russia for the last 400 days, a little over a year, doesn't mean in France in 1940 they had what they called the phony war, where they took Poland, the Germans took half of Europe, and then just sat on their hands until the spring came. And everybody thought, oh, well, I guess it's World War II without World War I without the shooting, until they invaded France in May of 1940. So you never know what's going to happen. So we've sent our guys into a hot combat zone with completely unequipped as far as what it takes to survive. They have no ability to defend themselves against air attack, no ability to call in their own artillery, no ability to even put a steel pot on their heads. I'm sorry, that's criminal.
Well, Nick, you're not going to get any argument from me. I think you're absolutely right in respect of everything that you've said on this particular subject. I think that what concerns me the most is the lack of ministerial responsibility. You know, this kind of thing, not that long ago, would have been just scandalous. And a minister of defense, at a minimum, the minister of defense would have had to resign as a consequence of this kind of fiasco. And in the past, governments have fallen over this kind of thing. But we're just not there anymore, Nick. There is no such thing as government taking responsibility for its decisions. There's no such thing as ministerial responsibility. Um, uh, Now, there was the recently the I believe it's the immigration minister. In any event, the citizenship and immigration or whatever, they uh, allowed or they eliminated the need for visas in 13 countries that previously required a visa to come to visit Canada. And when they eliminated these visas, all of a sudden people were applying for their entry, whatever, how online to be able to come to Canada. And the government website was processing so many of these applications that the system crashed. And the minister just sort of shrugged his shoulders and said, "Well, we've learned our lesson from that." And when you see that, Nick, and this is unfortunately, you and I we're at an age where we remember these things and how they used to be dealt with. But unfortunately, the majority of people out there don't have that experience, and they probably not only do they have not have the experience, but they also would not know. They wouldn't really understand the concept of ministerial responsibility. But it's just because something happens doesn't mean when the minister has to resign doesn't mean that it's his or her fault specifically, but somebody has to take responsibility and be accountable to the public and give them some confidence that these kinds of things are going to be thought about in advance as opposed to on the fly. And in this case that you're outlining right now, with respect to our military personnel that are in Eastern Europe, not only were these kinds of problems not considered at any level that we know of the military or the ministry, in advance of sending our personnel over, but when it starts to happen, there seems to be no kind of plan or effort to address the problem, and that just compounds the situation. So I don't know what this is. There are days that I wonder to myself, Nick, is it all gone? Can we? There was a short period of time where we had democratic government that was responsible, that was led by people who felt a certain obligation to their to the public, and but all of that's gone. The public doesn't seem to care that much about these kinds of things, and the nor do elected officials, and that's a tragedy.
There should be as much outrage over this as there is about that finally forced Mr. Johnson to step down as a special rapporteur, which is something we'll get to in a few minutes. But because when you think about it, if you send somebody overseas and you don't even give him a tin pot to put in your hand, he's not only is he going over to do the dirty work of democracy, as I like to call it, he's representing us. He becomes the face of Canada. When they go over there and they take to the field, the whole world, all our allies, everybody is watching how they behave and how they perform. And that's where your reputation either comes from or dies. And this guy, these bunch of bozos have put a stake through the heart of a reputation that was earned in blood. And I'm not talking going all the way back to World War II or even one or two or Korea. What about Afghanistan? I remember when we were on the air and terrestrial radio when everybody was in love with the military. I remember telling some members of the military, hang on to this because it's not going to last. They will forget about you, and they will forget about you relatively quickly. Once everybody's come home and the wars from our perspective is over, it'll fade, and you won't see it the way you see it now. And holy smokes, I never thought it would get this bad. Where are they? Here's another question. Where are the brigade commanders? Where are the generals who put these operations together? Did no one say, hey, where's the sandwiches? Did no one say, hey, why aren't these guys got helmets? They have to know what's going on. Did they sit on their hands? Why didn't they go to their boss and say, we are not leaving this country until we have everything we need? Because I am not sending my guys over there to potentially get killed, all because they didn't have a steel pot to put on their head. With these guys are the guys we got to go after too. Don't let them off the hook. You got senior leadership that's supposed to lead.
Well, this is a
okay. I'm done being a flaming volcano.
There's no question here, Nick, that what you're witnessing is a breakdown in leadership all the way from the top to the bottom. I hesitate to say, that the senior NCOs on the ground don't care, because they're in the same situation.
It's not that they don't care. What could they do about it?
But what is being done about it? There's clearly a breakdown in leadership here, and it's easy to blame the politicians, and I'm not going to defend them on this because ultimately the responsibility is theirs. But I know a thing or two about leadership, and military leadership, and so I know, do you, Nick? And the number one responsibility of a good leader is to look after the basic needs of his or her personnel, because you can't accomplish the mission if your personnel are wounded or hungry, or cold and wet, etc. Look, you get into this business knowing full well that if you're deployed, you're going to have to face some hardships. You're going to have to face some ultimately extreme hardships, potentially. But all the more reason why, if you're the leader, you have to go out of your way to mitigate any hardships that your personnel are enduring, and at all times, including peacetime or not necessarily, in the teeth of combat time, where the hardship maybe isn't so bad, but you still have an obligation. You don't find yourself a comfortable bed until you know that your men and women serving under you are sleeping comfortably in beds as well. And you don't eat until your personnel are fed and watered. It's basic leadership,
You're
Nick.
look, you're right. But the point I come back to is the squad leaders, the masters, well, in our case, the master seamen, master corporals, and the sergeants, and people like that,
Right.
who are in charge of squad level groups. They can't do anything.
No, fair enough.
I mean, even if you go up to company commanders, there's a certain point where you just salute and go off and do with whatever you have. But what I'm talking about is that from, let's say, the rank of captain up, who could do something if they wanted to, and they chose to sit on their hands.
Well,
there was no press conference.
Well, and now you're touching on the point I was about to make, Nick, and that is, where are the whistleblowers? Where are the senior officers and general officers who are so outraged? I mean, we'll even say, let's even give captains the benefit of the doubt. Let's start at major level, okay, which is where we start the senior officers level. So let's start at senior officers, majors, lieutenant commanders, lieutenant colonels, and colonels, okay? Let's start at that, and then general officers. Where are the resignations? Where are the whistleblowers?
Why did they not collect? Why did the head of the Canadian Army not walk to a podium and say, I'm not sending anybody anywhere until we get this fixed? If that causes him his job, he's still going to get his pension. I mean, there's some hills worth dying on. This is one of them, because it's so fundamental to the way this organization works.
Well,
and if you can't stand up to your boss and say, like hell, I'm doing that. I told a story during Answer the Call about what was the Minister of Munitions and Supply during World War One? Sam Hughes. And Lord Kitchener was the head of the Allied forces in Europe during World War One. And Canada had recruited, divisions of people, battalions, like thousands of men. And they trained them at Balcarce, put them on ships, sent them over to England. And Kitchener wanted to break them up, take their units apart, and just feed them willy-nilly into the British Army as replacements. And Sam Hughes walked into the number one guy on the Allied side. Now, you can say what you want about Sam Hughes, but he walked up and he said, "You cannot do this. You will kill recruiting in Canada." And Kitchener looked at him and said, "You will follow your orders." And he said, "I'll be damned if I will." And he turned and walked out. That's the kind of thing that has to happen. This kind of stuff is just, the more I think about this stuff, the angrier I get, because this is such an utter failing of the people who do the riskiest job in the democracy.
Nick, call it what it is. It's a failure of leadership. It's inexcusable.
Absolutely.
There is no possible explanation for this other than what I have to say, with all due respect, is the dry rot that has set in the, let's say, the senior ranks of our armed forces, particularly those who are responsible for the administration aspect of the military, logistics, supply, etc. And of course, the reality is that's the bulk of what you do in the military. Okay, it's only in the final analysis, it's only a small percentage of people who actually carry guns and shoot them at the enemy. Everything else is all about making sure that they're adequately fed, they're adequately supplied, that they have medical services that are available to them all times. And when people go, well, it's the military, so you have to expect that it's not going to be perfectly gold standard service. And I'm going, what? If you're asking these people to be prepared to sign a contract that obligates them to put their lives on the line, to defend you, to protect you, to serve you, you're damn right it's supposed to be gold standard, gold plated, and better.
Absolutely.
Okay? These guys
We
are
need to
earning
give
it
them
every single day.
Now, here's a little rub. The Danes have troops over there too. Guess where they bought their equipment, their helmets, their flak jackets, their firearms, their ammunition? Take a guess where it came from, Joseph. Canada. They bought them from Canadian companies. Yeah. Now, if the Danes can do that.
That was going to be my guess.
Oh my God. I saw that. No, I had to walk away because I was about ready to burst. It just, how is it the Danish armed military, which I'm guessing is probably about the same size as ours? And I have no bones with the Danes, don't get me wrong. But they float a navy, they have an army, they have an air force. Now, they don't have the geography we do, but they are, well, they're kind of like on par with us when it comes to military spending and all that sort of thing. How come they got helmets? How come they got camouflage? How come they got any localized anti-air defense? What's going on here? Can you imagine being on a modern battlefield with the kind of technology that aircraft carry today without some ability to defend yourself against them and against drones? You might as well send somebody from 1850 over there with a musket and a ramrod. Okay, I'm going to calm down. Really.
And to add insult to injury, this is what we're doing. This is the way we're treating our personnel in defense of the Ukraine.
I know. That makes me nuts.
They're not even defending us and our interests, in my view, anyway.
Well, like I said before, he's no Zelensky, and his government over there are dictatorial in their attitudes. If you don't want to use the word dictator, okay, but he's walking a mighty thin line. All right. Now I
I
don't have
don't
any problem him defending his territory.
here's the thing, okay? The reason I never get into this is because I don't care. He could be, everyone keeps saying he's no Winston Churchill. Absolutely correct. Okay, Vladimir Zelensky is no Winston Churchill, and the Ukraine is no United Kingdom fighting against tyranny, fighting against the Nazis, the bulwark of civilization against fascism. There's no comparison whatsoever. But even if there was, even if Ukraine was a perfect modern liberal, I use the term loosely, small L liberal democracy, even if Vladimir Zelensky himself was on a level of a Winston Churchill, I would still oppose what we're doing in the Ukraine because there are many, many factors involved, many variables that go into making a decision whether or not you're going to involve yourself in a military conflict that potentially could get out of hand, blow up at any time, and quite literally. And I just don't see
Yeah.
that our interests are so deeply engaged in deterring the Russians. I don't even see this as deterring the Russian expansionism. I have no
Well,
defense for what the Russians are doing, but I am not convinced that we have to support Ukraine in order to deter Russian expansionism. I don't see the evidence for Russian expansionism.
well, the U.S. Senator Ted Cruz said that really what we have here in Ukraine is a border war between Ukraine
And
and
I agree
Russia,
with that.
and we have no business being in.
If the
And I was just going to say the same thing
if the
because, first of
Russians
all, even let me
go
sorry,
ahead.
I was just going to say, even if there was a vested Canadian interest in Ukraine, I couldn't imagine what it is, but let's say there is, for the sake of this discussion. We're in no position to offer any more than a go get him guy
True.
kind of
That's
support,
true.
moral support at best, because we don't have the logistics, we don't have the equipment, we don't have the manpower, and yet, and it's so bad, and they wonder why recruiting in Canada is down. I mean, come on, who wants to sign up for that?
No,
Anyway,
it's a
I'm going
no,
off
it's a real
today.
problem. But I'm watching the clock here, Nick. So we're going to have to go for a break in another minute or so. But
Yeah.
I don't. Before we go for the break, I do want to get this off my chest because I think it's important
Okay.
when we talk about deterrence. Okay, when we talk about deterring the Russians, and because if we don't stop them in the Ukraine, who knows where they're going to go? There, I'm waiting, and look, I like to say I'd rather be right than consistent. So if I'm wrong about this, if there's something I'm missing, by all means, tell us, okay? But I don't see the evidence that the Russians are preparing for a long-term campaign of expansionism. Because if they were, let's not forget that there are a whole lot of other countries out there that used to be part of the Soviet Union that would be easy picking for them. Georgia, Armenia,
Yeah.
Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, okay, Azerbaijan, and then there's the Baltic countries, and I don't see any real interest for the Russians to invade the Baltic countries, given the diplomatic outrage that would ensue. But there are other Eastern European countries, okay, Belarus, Moldova. I just, I am, I don't see,
Latvia.
I just don't see where people are looking at this and saying those Russians, they want to, they all they want to do is reassemble the Soviet Union, and I that may be a legitimate concern, but at some point in time, you have to ask yourself, if you're Vladimir Putin and you are seriously wanting to reestablish the old Soviet Union, you're not going to start with Ukraine, okay? I mean, am I wrong? Is there something that I'm missing here?
Well, first of all, I think that let's for the sake of discussion say that he did want to start with Ukraine, and Ukraine's turned out to be a much harder nut to crack than he ever thought it was going to be, and that alone, the fact that they just didn't roll over and let him walk in, would temper any expansions. So that if that is your goal, you've already accomplished it. Because now, if he wants to go into Latvia, well, there's Poland and there's Germany and France right next door, with pretty substantial militaries of their own, who, if you think the Ukrainians were tough, take on the Poles. Good luck. So history goes against that kind of mentality, and it's already been accomplished. So what's the point?
And
other than throwing the last of the Russians?
And the Russian government is not. It's not a communist government full of vim and vigor and fervor to expand and export communism around the world. So I can't help but think that what we're seeing here is we're seeing policymakers who grew up as we did in the Cold War era, and to a large degree, in some cases anyway, I won't say cut their teeth, because in many cases, we forget how old we're getting and how old the younger kids that were around when we were, or that were just kids when we were around. We forget how old they are now. They're the ones making policy. But I cannot help but think, Nick, that there's an element of trying to refight or the Cold War, when the Cold War was fought and won already. That's
yeah.
I don't know. That's just the way I see it.
That makes sense.
We got to go for a break.
All right. Well, I think we'll take that break.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. So we'll be back in a couple of minutes here on Out of Control with Nick and Joe.
That's right.
Ice cream. Give me ice cream with whipped cream. Ice cream. Give me ice cream with whipped cream. Ice cream. A million flavors, let's just do it. Tie me up with ice cream. Sunny days need that cold hit. Ice cream. A million flavors, let's just do it. Tie me up with ice cream. Sunny days need that cold hit. That strawberry chocolate taste, high school vanilla for me. Hundreds and thousands, I need an ice cream island. Give me ice cream with whipped cream, strawberry sauce, and see my face gleam. I need a wafer on top, just ice cream full stop. So take me to the pudding shop. Ice cream, a million flavors, let's just do it. Tie me up with ice cream. Sunny days need that cold hit. Ice cream, a million flavors, let's just do it. Tie me up with ice cream. Sunny days need that cold hit. That strawberry chocolate.
All right, welcome back to the Out of Control show with Nick and Joe. One of the things I wanted to dig into, Joseph, and pick your brain about was the idea in the National Post story this week. As most of us know, unless they live under rocks on Mars, David Johnson stepped down as a special rapporteur looking into Chinese influence in our election process. First of all, we went over it before, like why would he even accept the job in the first place? So I'm not going to go there. Eventually, public pressure got to the point, and going back to the last topic, this is what drives me crazy. People will put enough pressure on the government to make this change, but they won't. Anyway, okay, you get the point. All right. So in the National Post, it asked the question, what are Trudeau's options? So I'll read just a couple paragraphs here to set the tone for the discussion. The resignation of David Johnson from his role as the federal Liberal government's independent special rapporteur looking into allegations of interference by China in Canadian elections leaves Prime Minister Justin Trudeau with few options other than to commission the public inquiry that opposition parties have been demanding since the allegations first surfaced. Goes on to say, look, he really has to call. He's got three choices. He can just let it go and say, that's it, we're done. He can call one, and I forget what the third choice was. Doesn't matter. The point is he either calls one or he doesn't. First of all, does it matter, really? Because as you know, when you get into the blue ribbon panels or special investigations or things like that, they can drag on for years. Now, he wants to stay in power till at least 2025, and that's what the NDP is for, to make sure that happens. So let's say that for the sake of discussion, he decides that, all right, I've heard the Canadian people. I've heard what David Johnson's gone, so that card is no longer in my hands. Let's call this special election or special investigation and see, or board of inquiry. Call it what you want. Put a rose on it, whatever you want to do. What stops him? What compels him now? Let's say it takes 6 months, and at the end of it, they say, yeah, there was collusion. If he won't cave to pressure at this point to step down as he should and call an election, as he should have done half a dozen times, maybe more, in his tenure as prime minister, what is going to be different this time, if anything?
Well, let's unpack this. First of all, I think that David Johnson did the right thing by stepping down. I deeply regret the damage that has been done to his reputation as a consequence of this whole fiasco. As you know, Nick, and without getting into details, I thought that he would do a good job because I know David Johnson well enough to know that he is a man of impeccable character and integrity. And so at first I supported his taking on the role, but then I realized that probably he should have turned it down because there was this perception that he was close to the Trudeau family and a friend of Justin Trudeau, which I can tell you categorically is not the case, but we'll just leave it at that, okay? People believed it. There was evidence that could be pointed to that led people to reach that conclusion. And I'm a believer that it's not just about justice. Justice it's not just about doing justice. Justice has to be seen to be done. So it's not just about the integrity of the process here, but it's also the perception of integrity. And once that perception was wounded, it was never coming back. So I think that he did the right thing here by stepping down. And now what he should do is he should basically wash his hand of everything. And now that's it. Make no more comments about it to the public and just leave it be. Let the whole thing die. I will say this. I think that I do want to say that I have not heard any allegations of collusion leveled. There are allegations of Chinese interference in our elections, but I haven't heard anybody speak about collusions. Collusion, meaning that somehow or other the Chinese and the government, that is to say, the prime minister, in bed together in order to influence the election. I haven't heard that allegation made, and so who knows, right? Except to say this, Nick, as I've said already, the opportunity to have any real influence over our elections, in the way that's being suggested with respect to China, is really quite limited. And as you know, with our limitations, strict laws with respect to campaign finance, both donations and spending, and with our system where we have individual ridings and we have secret ballots, etc. It's really difficult to influence an election. And did the Chinese try to? Maybe they did. Maybe they didn't. But I'm skeptical about how much influence they actually had. There is a question of how much influence the Chinese might have on government policy, given whatever
That's right.
the Chinese government might have to the Trudeau Family Foundation, and there might be some quid pro quo there. We don't know, and I suppose that might be a subject of an investigation. Let me just say that also, Nick, I have to say that the Prime Minister has handled this whole affair really badly. It's been badly managed from the word go. The fact is that no pun intended, but you have to be able, if you're going to be a successful politician, and I don't think that Justin Trudeau has been very successful as a politician. I think whatever perception of success is out there is really due to a lack of good, credible opposition, knowledgeable on process and procedure on how to accomplish, what the opposition ought to be accomplishing. Again, but I'm not impressed with the way, from a purely political science point of view, with the way the Prime Minister has handled this whole thing. Probably, you should have been able to read the tea leaves right away that, yeah, this is a major issue. People are talking about it. It's got legs, as we say in the business. It's not going to go away. The media is onto this, and not just the right-wing media, but neutral and left-wing media as well. He probably should have called for a public inquiry right from the word go. And you go out there and say, nothing to hide. Let's find out. I'm just as concerned as the next person is. In the end, I think that's what he's going to have to do. I think he's got to set up a public inquiry at this stage, because anything else is just going to look bad.
It's like I said. But it's like I said, okay, he sets up a public inquiry. And I think the influence isn't at the ballot box, it's over government policy.
Could be, yeah.
That's where I think the influence is.
That's
like when I hear that,
I would be more concerned. Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely. Because if they can help get him elected, now he owes them something.
Well, I don't think
you never want to be in a position where you.
But let's be clear, Nick. I don't think they can help him get elected. But what they could do is there could still be a quid pro quo, in that he's they're funneling money to his foundation, and how is that money being spent, and what kind of a nest egg is being built there for him after he leaves politics. I don't know.
Why didn't he? What? So there's some circumstantial evidence that would suggest it's policy more than the ballot box, like the Chinese police. I want to call them offices, police detachments in Canada. Was like they have more diplomats in Canada than in Quebec alone than they have in all of France. Why? This is where I think the influence comes from. And so the question becomes, at least in my mind, so we carry this on. Well, let's say we take, a year to get to the bottom of this. What stops them shrugging his shoulders and say, okay, we did it, now let's move on?
Well, ultimately nothing. But I will say this, Nick: these kinds of inquiries generally they have results, and the people, the government does follow through on certain recommendations, not all, but it's they have. It's not a given that the government can just ignore whatever the outcome of this, if indeed there isn't a public inquiry. It's not given that the government could easily ignore the results. They might. Nobody can predict that. And what possible measures can be taken to ensure that they don't ignore whatever the outcome is? A strong, effective opposition for starters, and a strong, effective media as well. These are the things that hold governments to account in a democratic society. And the question is, how strong and effective ultimately is the opposition in our country under the new leader Pierre Poilievre, and how really effective is the media? I would say I'm still reserving judgment on the political side. On the media side, I'm not holding back and reserving judgment. I think that our media, journalists, I think journalism in this country is dead. There are very few real journalists out there who are interested in pursuing the truth wherever it leads. The tragedy is, it's not just partisan. It's not that they're in the tank for the liberals. It's that they're just not serious journalists. Period. So hence you get a situation where, well, let's take what we were talking about before on the show. These forest fires are being caused by global warming. Well, that's reported everywhere, okay? But how many of those journalists have actually delved into it? How many of them have investigated? How many of them have asked tough questions of policymakers? How many of them have said, okay, that's one side of this story that's being put out there. Maybe what I'll do is I'm going to make a few phone calls and see if there's an alternative point of view, and then reporting that and let people decide. That's what journalism has always been about. But it's not like that anymore. The problem with our journalism in this country, and I think that we're seeing it more and more in the United States, isn't that it's partisan liberal. It's that it's not real journalism. Period. Full stop. They're lazy.
Yes, intellectual laziness is something that has afflicted not only journalists, but a lot of people, because it's just so much easier to say, well, I guess if the government says so, it's got to be that way. And that attitude makes me nuts. As you pointed out earlier, after all the mistakes and failings they've made over the last 15, 20 years,
Yeah.
why in God's name would you listen to a single word they say?
But Nick, you still, with all due respect, Nick, you still want to politicize it. You still want to fall back to that default position of Trudeau is bad, the Liberals are bad. How could you possibly believe in
No,
what they have
I'm
to say?
speaking more generally.
And that may be, again, I'm not saying you're wrong, but I'm saying that's not the problem with the journalists today. The problem with the journalists today is not that they believe what the government is saying. The problem with the journalists today is that they pick up the paper. How do you, if you're a reporter at the Calgary Herald, how do you get your stories, and etc.? Well, you don't come to Ottawa and meet with politicians and ask tough questions. You read, and I'm picking on the Calgary Herald, and maybe I shouldn't be, but let's say hypothetically, let's call it the Calgary North Star or whatever, a hypothetical newspaper, okay? Well,
Yeah.
their reporters get their stories from other reporters who get it from other reporters. They and almost verbatim. And you see this, well, you saw it around with the stuff with the climate change, where this was really apparent was last year with the convoy protests here in Ottawa,
Yeah.
where you had maybe a handful of journalists who were reporting on it. Most journalists who were reporting on it didn't actually get on the ground and interview people. They just took government talking points. And then what happens is they report those things as facts. And then before you know it, every other journalist, every other newspaper and media outlet in the country is just mimicking them. And I'm going, why wouldn't you send, if you're the Vancouver Sun, why wouldn't you send, or you're living just outside of Victoria. What about the Times columnist, the Victoria Times columnist? Why wouldn't you send a reporter from Victoria to Ottawa for a week to really delve into this? This is like this is an international story unfolding in real time here in Canada, and you can't even spare a couple of dollars to send a reporter to do some on the ground investigative reporting that is unique to the Times columnist and any other newspaper or media outlet. So you depend on the pool people, and the pool people report a certain way, and that's the end of it. And so it's a terrible, really bad situation. Okay, it's a bad situation that has everything to do with, I have to be perfectly honest here on how I feel. Okay, it's a bad situation that has everything to do with laziness on the part of the journalists and the so-called journalist industry, journalism industry.
Yeah, well, when I was talking before, I wasn't talking about it's all Trudeau's fault. I was talking in broader terms than that.
Okay.
When when somebody in a lab coat or somebody comes along and says, "Look, the Earth is flat and it's got rounded corners," I'm sorry, I'm a little skeptical. You know, and I think that when I say that with all the mistakes they have made, that's the royal they, that's the UN, that's the World Health Organization, that's governments in the Western world across, like Boris Johnson just resigned in Britain today. Why? I don't know. I didn't have a chance to look into it. But I think there's a sense of, you and I are not the only ones who are getting tired of this. So I think we talked about this last time, where there's a growing backlash against this kind of thing. And trust in the media, because you're quite right. I completely agree with you about journalistic laziness. It's easy to just go to Reuters or go to some other newswire, pull your international stories, look at what other people in Canada are writing about the forest fires or global warming or whatever the topic du jour is, and then throw that together with a few changes in it for you, make it look like your own work, and there you go. It's easy. And people like easy. They don't want to actually dig in. We watched a great movie last night. I believe it was either I thought it was Russian made. They were all speaking English, but the actors actually had Russian accents, which was refreshing. It's about a guy who found out there was what do they call, serial killer killing 9 to 15-year-old boys in Russia just after the war. And it was fascinating because he was faced with the same thing, this inertia that's always getting in the way because in paradise there are no murders kind of thing. And I was struck by the similarities, maybe not politically, down to that kind of level.
We just lost Nick for a few minutes there, so he'll be back with us in a couple of minutes. Yeah, just sort of getting back onto the subject. Oh, he's back again. That was pretty quick, actually. Hang on just a second. We'll pull him back in. There you are, Nick.
Okay, so let me just finish up. Basically, there were a lot of threads in that story. It's called the Child 44. And there was like 40. That's when they really noticed that there's a problem. So he went after him, bucked the system, and finally brought the bad guy to justice. And in Canada, when you look at that, we haven't got there yet. It's the same kind of atmosphere where people are either afraid or lazy and complacent because there's a certain element of fear. A lot of people don't want to talk out because they're afraid of the consequences. And between the movie and reality, there's not a lot of difference. There's enough that I'm not going to call Canada Stalinist Russia, but when it comes to journalism doing the job, the guy who is the main character in the movie, went from being a big wig in the KGB down to a local militia guy way out in the middle of nowhere. And he still was able to do it because he wouldn't give up. He wanted the truth. But we don't have enough of that here.
Well, this is what it all comes down to. And you know, it's just gotten so bad that if I read tomorrow in the mainstream media that the Earth was round, I'd want to see proof. They're reporting the Earth is round. Okay, yeah, let's. I'll take that with a grain of salt. You know, and somebody's going to take that clip. By the way, somebody's going to take that clip and use it. It's going to go around, and people are going to go, "You see, those guys really think the Earth is flat." No, I don't think the Earth is flat, and I'm pretty sure Nick doesn't think the Earth is flat. I'm just saying that
I'm convinced the Earth is not flat.
There
is no map that's real that says beyond here be dragons.
It's just that I'm fed up. I am so full of skepticism that I just don't believe anything that I see out there anymore unless I see evidence of it. And the good news is I don't have to believe everything in order to get on with my, day-to-day life. So frankly, whether the Earth is flat or round doesn't make a whole lot of difference to me, unless of course I have to sail, across the ocean, in which case it darn well better be round.
Be round. That's right.
Okay.
It's going to make your trip a lot more interesting if it isn't.
But you know what I'm saying, Nick. It's
yeah, of course I do.
It's a serious problem.
The idea that
when you can't trust anyone, and then all of a sudden everything out there becomes credible, and this is where we get a lot of the conspiracy theories out there, and the worst part about all of that is that then you get the authorities, quote unquote, that fight back against the conspiracy theorists and never ask themselves, why are there conspiracy theories out there? Like, how is it that these things happen? And take some responsibility for it. There's a term for people like us sometimes. People sometimes call us reactionaries. That's a fair term. But my response when people say, you're a reactionary, and I usually point out that the very fact that you're calling me a reactionary is an indication that there's something happening out there that I am reacting to. And so it's not good enough to simply point the finger and say, "Oh, you don't believe you don't believe anymore what scientists are saying." You know what, Nick? You heard it here first. No, I don't. I want to see the research. I want to see the study. I want to see what the experiments were. I want to understand the theory. Explain it to me, and I'll make my own decisions. But I don't take anything on authority anymore, because these guys have just been so not just wrong, but they have completely abandoned any kind of credible approach to scientific research. And I could use that criticism in so many areas of public policy out there now, and I just don't believe anything now when I'm told this is the truth, and I go, okay, yeah, it may be, but I want to see. Okay, I reserve judgment on everything, and I reserve the right.
It's tragic.
Go ahead.
It's tragic that we've come to this point, because I would like to believe the scientists. And look, it really depends on what you're talking about too. Like if a scientist comes up and says, "Look, penicillin's a great defense against bacterial infection." All right, fine. We know that's true. I'm not going to argue with him on it. If I have a brain surgeon tell me, you know what, we don't take that tumor out, you're going to die. All right, I'm going to listen to him. But if he comes up and says, well, this is this and that's that, well, how did you get to that conclusion? Because especially with new stuff or stuff that's really off the wall, you want to make sure that because a lot of times people have either vested interest or carry their own biases into their research. That's why they're supposed to be in this scientific method. Somebody else has to do your experiment and get the same results. If they don't accept it. So therefore, consensus is not how you do science. As Einstein was famous for saying, it doesn't take a consensus to defeat one of my theories. It takes one fact. And people have forgotten that. And that's why there's such a great distrust, because you and I are not the only ones who feel this way. That's why there's such a great distrust amongst the population for things like big pharma, for oil industry, you name it. Anywhere there's scientific research done, people are saying, I don't know if I believe this anymore.
Okay.
And it's all because they have destroyed their own credibility.
Okay, let's go for our final break, Nick. We'll be back in a couple of minutes here on Out of Control with Nick and Joe.
Yep.
And that was, ladies and gentlemen, not the break music.
What?
All right, here we go. And we are back.
All right, welcome back here. We are. I was just looking for the next story. Here it is. There we are.
And Nick keeps cutting in and out, so we've lost him again, and he's coming back again. I'm not entirely sure what's going on with him, but let's get an explanation. Nick, my friend, what's going on over there, man? We're losing you. And
the explanation is I have no idea. 1 minute you're there, and the next minute I get a little brown bar on my screen that says, "No, you're not."
Well, we've been here all along.
My wife is whispering. My wife is whispering, "Roger's internet on a boat." Okay, maybe that's it.
Well,
anyway, be that as it may, there is another serious issue on the horizon, in kind of on the back burner lately. although there's been a few interesting encounters, everybody's caught up with Trump and with the forest fires and all that stuff, and with what's going on here in Canada. So the international stage isn't getting the press it probably should. We were involved with an American cruiser. One of our frigates was with an American destroyer and had not an altercation, but they got a little too close for comfort. Chinese warship in the Straits of Taiwan. That was interesting in and of itself. There have been multiple incursions by the Chinese Air Force into Taiwan airspace, and they've had to scramble their aircraft in response to this incursion. So that's just a little bit of the background of what's going on here, and what they're really worried about. This article comes from a website called The Conversation. Deals more with a high-techy kind of stuff. But what they're really worried about is that the microchip industry would implode if China invaded Taiwan, and it would have an effect on everyone. Because let's face it, the technology we're using right now is all based on semiconductors or microchips.
It seems that your internet provider must be depending on some of that too. I'm wondering whether or not there's some Chinese government interference going on right now in our show, that they keep on knocking Nick out of the show. I don't know.
All right, I quit talking as soon as I got knocked off. But basically, the semiconductor industry, Taiwan has about over 90% of it cornered. So the vast majority of computer chips that we use every day for everything you can think of, from defense to your home computers to you name it, the industry or the product, and there's probably a Taiwanese microchip in it. And China, if they invade, they're afraid that the access to those microchips is going to be cut off, because as anybody knows, they're always producing new cell phones, they're always producing new technology, all based on these advances in chip technology the Taiwanese are making. So let me share with you, and if I can keep from getting bounced this time, a couple paragraphs of this story. A conflict between the US and China over computer chips, or semiconductors, has been escalating in recent months. In particular, the US has taken steps to limit China's access to advanced chip technology amid heightened international competition in the area. The US recently tightened export controls to undercut China's access to high-end chip manufacturing equipment, and has banned top talent from working for Chinese semiconductor firms. Beijing retaliated, surprise, surprise, by banning the US chipmaker Micron from operating in China. Taiwan plays a critical role in this struggle. It has a huge share of the global semiconductor industry, but it's also the focus of tensions between Beijing and Washington over its political status. For all practical purposes, Taiwan has been independent since 1949, but Beijing believes it should be reunited with the rest of China, possibly by force. In April 2023, China conducted extensive military drills near Taiwan, simulating an encirclement of the island. All right, anyway, one more. The article goes on to say the U.S. since 1979 has a pact with Taiwan of self-defense, so they're going to come to Taiwan's aid. A Democratic congressman from Massachusetts, Seth Moulton, recently quipped that if China invades, we're going to blow up the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, the world's most valuable semiconductor company. He later clarified that he had been discussing several options for conveying the enormous cost of invading Taiwan to Beijing, because it would hurt China too. But this just goes to show you how delicate this whole thing is. This is much different than what's going on between Ukraine and Russia. Every country in the world has an interest in what's going on in Taiwan because of the impact it has on technological advancing. I mean, you know, it's like going from a crank phone to a dial phone once you go forward, you can't go back. It's the same thing. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out in the next few months, because nobody's really watching very closely other than the people directly involved. But I'm talking about in the general public. There's too many other distractions. And that's got, I'm certainly, I don't like reading this kind of stuff, because if they do that, there's going to be a lot of damage done to critical technology that all of us depend on.
Which means we'll all be having to go back to growing our own food in our own backyards, I guess.
Victory gardens, here we come. It's hard to do that on a 48-foot boat.
You can or cannot.
It's difficult. My wife could probably pull it off, but we are also on the biggest fish locker in the world. As a matter of fact, Allison was coming down from the grocery store and she had a bag of chips, just regular potato chips. And we use wheelbarrows to carry stuff down because it's too far to walk from the parking lot to, if your arms are full and you got a wheelbarrow, you use that. So anyway, she had the bag kind of sticking out the corner of the wheelbarrow, and the guy walked over and said, chips. And she looked at him, and he had a bag full of halibut fillets. And she said, fish. And he said, I'll trade you some fish for some chips. And she said, no, come on. That's not a fair deal. He says, no. And he insisted. So we gave him a bag of potato chips, and he gave us about almost $100 worth of halibut. And oh, man, is it good. He had just caught it and cleaned it. It hadn't even left. It was barely out of the ocean. So if we had to feed ourselves, we might get sick of fish, but we could do it. Anyway.
Yeah, I don't know, Nick, what to say about the Taiwan situation. I except to say that I would recommend, if I was having a meeting with policymakers, I would recommend to them that they not allow themselves to get too narrowly focused on Taiwan. Taiwan, of course, is a flashpoint, as is the Korean Peninsula. When it comes specifically to China, though, for sure, Taiwan is a flashpoint. But Taiwan and the potential conflict in Taiwan only constitutes a very small portion of what the Chinese are doing around the world very actively in order to extend their power and their influence. And so, and I don't think, particularly in international finance, I don't think that the American administration, I don't want to say that they aren't taking it seriously enough. I just don't think that they've been doing anything about it that's been very effective. And as a consequence, you see this very slow but very definite move away from the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. And that could have potentially devastating effects on the US economy, depending on how all of that plays out, which of course will only affect us here in Canada, and other countries around the world. So the Chinese are. I'm not, again, this is pure speculation on my part. I don't have any evidence to suggest that this is true, but let me paint a scenario for you that the Chinese government is willing to be antagonistic with respect to Taiwan and to take risks to foment concern and outrage in Taiwan and on the Taiwan issue, simply as a means of distracting the American administration, and frankly the rest of us, distracting us away from, drawing our attention away from all of the other things that the Chinese are doing in order to expand their influence around the globe. And so, and they are for sure doing that, and they're doing it right here in Canada and in the United States.
Well, they have
Like
They have this policy called the Silk Road. You're familiar with the Silk Road policy that China has, where
yeah,
they
as a
want
matter of fact, sure.
to. Yeah, it's the Silk Road is the old silk trading route from China to Europe and so on, and at different points around the Mediterranean and different points around the world at the time, the world as they knew it at the time. So they have readopted that philosophy where they want control over ports, they want control over resources, whatever it takes to keep China going. It's like the old Roman Empire,
Right.
where everybody fed Rome. And they want Beijing to be the center of the universe from an economic point of view. And they're going out, and that's why they bought the Port of Churchill in Manitoba. That's why they bought the Port of Vancouver. That's why they own all kinds of, and it's not just in Canada they're doing this. They're doing this all over the world, in Ghana and Africa, different African countries, because they want to be able to just pick off the shelf whatever they need. So they come in and they promise all these great things for a country like Ghana, as an example. Look, we'll build your roads, we'll do whatever it takes, but we want your port. And Ghana, being a third world country, says, oh, whatever you want, because they can't do it on their own. And the West won't do it. So it's certainly, it's really short-sighted policy on the Western democracies to not give real tangible aid other than what I call Band-Aid aid to these third world countries. They write a check to a dictator over there, a little tin pot dictator. He buys an F-16 and steps over the starving bodies of his people on the way to the plane. I'm just kind of giving an image there. I don't mean to say that that's actually right. So the thing about Taiwan, though, that, like you said, it's only one small part. You're right, it is. But it is an absolutely critical part. Like your spark plug is only one small part of your car, but try running an engine without it. Every one you take out, it gets worse. So Taiwan, I hear what you're saying. They're using right hand to keep so no one sees what the left hand's doing. But it's also a pretty important thing. You have to keep, in other words, you have to cast a broader net than that includes Taiwan and everything else they're doing. And that's just with everything else going on. I think that stretches people's mental resources who are in positions to make these decisions about how to react to these things to the breaking point, because there are just so many things going on.
Yeah, and as I say, Nick, I don't have any evidence to support my theory, and I'm not even positing it as a viable theory. I'm just asking the question:
Right.
Is it possible that the Chinese government is playing up its activities in the South China Sea, in and around Taiwan, as a means of distracting Western governments away from some of these other things that are going on that are ultimately going to be, equally important. So, and precisely because, as you say, that what's going on in Taiwan is a lightning rod, if you will. It's a match, and so people are particularly concerned about what may or may not happen in Taiwan. If I was the Chinese government, okay, I would be tempted, as a matter of strategy, I'd be tempted to do exactly this kind of thing, not because I had a particular intention of invading Taiwan, but because it's just a cheap way for me to distract the other countries around the world. So, from a strategic point of view, and again, I'm not saying that this is what's happening, but it would not surprise me if this was the case, because ultimately, if you're looking for increasing your hegemony around the world, uh, you know, conquering Taiwan isn't going to do it. That may be part of it, but if I could control the trade in major trade routes because I own the ports, and increasing my size of my navy, so I have some ability to project naval power around the world that I didn't have before, and I can control trade routes and trade access points into and out of some of these Western countries, I could probably accomplish whatever I want to accomplish, including on Taiwan, without necessarily firing a shot. Now, of course, that doesn't take into account, the Taiwanese themselves who would not surrender. But then, why? If I'm the Chinese government, I have to ask myself: do I really need to have territorial control over Taiwan when I can control all of these other aspects of world trade, etc.? And okay, let the Taiwanese do whatever they want to do, and I'm going to benefit from their technological advancements as well. So that's kind of what I'm saying. I'm not saying that this is for sure what's happening. What I'm saying is that it wouldn't surprise me to learn, in fact, that that was part of it. I'm just trying to see what's going on here because I have done something and I just don't know what I have done to minimize the. So what am I doing here? I have done something in this. I've done something on this and I'm not really sure what it is. Okay, that's not what I want to do. Anyway, my goodness gracious. Okay, that's not what I want to do. I have done something, ladies and gentlemen, to my computer screen, and I don't know, frankly, what I have done. So what happens if I close this here? Oh, there we go. Okay. So hang on just a second, Nick. My apologies, my friends. All right, there we go.
There we are. I knew I'd come back sooner or later. I was just going to make the comment that I hope that's how China, Beijing's looking at it. And I'm being distinct. Well, okay, I'm not going to throw that caveat out there. It's not the Chinese people we have a problem with.
Okay, and we seem to have lost Nick again, so my apologies for some of these technical difficulties, ladies and gentlemen. Look, the reality is that none of us really know what's going on with the Chinese government. If you looked up the word inscrutable in the dictionary, you could very easily see a picture of the Chinese leadership next to the definition, because we don't really know what's going on in the minds of the Chinese government, and they are truly inscrutable. And so, anyway, Nick, you got cut off there.
Yeah, I was just saying, I certainly hope your attitude about the way that Beijing's looking at it is right, because don't forget the Chinese have a completely different way of looking at things, and I think a lot of times what the big challenge is for Western governments is try to put their heads inside what's going on in the leadership of the CCP, and it's not always easy to do because they come from a completely different culture, different background. They value different things than we do. So it's very, very hard to try to read the tea leaves. Like, if you want to know what the Americans are thinking, it's not hard to find out. And you can understand it, even if you don't agree with it, or you might, because we're so close culturally. We get it. But if you go to a country like Uzbekistan with no idea of what the culture is like, you're probably going to make a mess of things. And that's the same thing with China. To say that they could take the island without firing a shot, I know what you mean. They could control it economically without needing to control it militarily, and not have to have the territory fly the Chinese flag. Yeah, but I'm thinking as you're saying that, but the Chinese they've got since 1949, this has been one of their goals. Are they willing to say, forget it, it's over? Or are they willing to say, no, it doesn't matter, we're going to do whatever it takes to take it back. And I don't care if it's going to cost the whole world to do it. We're going to do it because
Nick, okay, so I think what we'll do, given the fact that we've just lost Nick again, and we're coming up to the end of the show anyway. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think what we'll do is we're going to call it an evening here on Out of Control with Nick and Joe. So, again, ending the show a few minutes early, but we just had a number of ongoing recurrent technical issues that we've had to deal with. So we're going to call it an evening, and hopefully we'll get everything ironed out, and we'll be able to do an even better job next week. So join us again next week here on Out of Control with Nick and Joe.